Happy Friday. I'm so excited for this conversation. And for those of you maybe who are going to be listening to the recording, really excited that you joined. For those of you in the audience, thank you for being here live. We really appreciate it. The human being I have with me today on stage, I think, is absolutely incredible. And I'm so excited to dive into today's topic. We're going to be talking about inclusive leadership and also how to insert consciousness into leadership. I shared some thoughts that we might cover, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be a wide-ranging conversation. There's so many different things that my guest has experience in and so many different things that she can talk about. So if anyone from the audience at any point in time wants to share their perspective, has a question for Marie, you are more than welcome to raise your hand, and we want to bring you onto stage because this is meant to be an engaging conversation. To start us off, Marie, and to let everyone know a little bit about all the different areas of expertise that you have, can you please take a second to introduce yourself?
Sure. And thank you so much, Akua, for having me on. I know we've been talking about having this conversation for a while, so really excited to be here. And hello to everyone who's listening in the audience or who is listening to the recording. My name is Marie Deveaux. I am an inclusive leadership coach and DEI consultant, and I've been in private practice doing this work since 2016. And so my work really spans supporting leaders and teams as they step into more authentic leadership and really supporting them creating cultures of inclusion and really actions that foster feelings of belonging in their workspaces. Another kind of passion of mine is also supporting Black and Brown women as they transition out of toxic workplaces. So a lot of my work also spans this idea of healing from the toxicity of traumatic workplace experiences and how we move forward from that place. So very excited to be on and to be engaging in this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Marie. And maybe before we actually start with some of the topics I have here, can you share a bit about your life before you decided to work for yourself? What were you doing?
Yes, absolutely. So my background has predominantly been in learning and development and in the training industry. So prior to starting my practice, I had a fairly lengthy career, just a couple of decades long, working in the for-profit education industry. So did a lot of work with organizations such as Kaplan and SCORE and Kumon math and reading centers. And my role throughout these organizations was really supporting leaders and adults step into their leadership, all in service of supporting young minds and young learners. So did a lot of work around management consulting for internal businesses, as well as developing leadership training and development programs for leaders across a range of different education type organizations. So that was my work immediately prior to stepping into entrepreneurship. And because I was running learning and development teams, it really felt like a natural transition for me to just start my own firm. And so that's where I found myself today.
Yes. And so what made you step into entrepreneurship? Was there a particular thing that happened? Was there something that you realized? What drove you to join the entrepreneurs?
Yes, well, I love this question because I think for most entrepreneurs, the choice to step on your own is very much personal. Mm-hmm. And, I say to all of my entrepreneur colleagues and friends, there are easier ways to make a living than starting your own business. So to choose this path, there must be some internal motivation or factor that's really driving you to say, you know what, I think I want to be more independent. And for me, especially in thinking about the work that I do now and helping others transition into this space, it had a lot to do with workplace trauma. Mm-hmm. And I was really the subject of bullying in my last full-time role. Wow. I was on a team and in a department that did not fully appreciate the value that I was bringing, and it became very clear through their actions that they were actually threatened by me. And so when I started my current practice, I really started by starting to look at other ways and other places where I could add value, since what I was providing in my full-time role was not being acknowledged or appreciated. And through that experience, I actually found that was far more rewarding and fulfilling than continuing to be on the receiving end of trauma in my current workplace. And so when I started my practice, I had already built quite a number of clientele, even while I maintained a full-time job. And then it was a very somewhat seamless transition for me to just slowly, transition away from that full-time role and providing less and less energy there, and then really fully stepping into entrepreneurship because it was much more fulfilling and felt that, working for myself was actually much more rewarding and provided me far more acknowledgement than I was receiving in my full-time role.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. I mean, we've had, a few conversations, but I didn't realize there was that element. For those listening that maybe don't really understand what workplace trauma or even what bullying is, would you mind just giving a quick definition? Because I've definitely had conversations with leaders and they tend to not necessarily, understand, right? Or can't really wrap their heads around what that would look like.
Yeah, so when I think about workplace bullying or even workplace harassment, it's often has very overt actions taken by those whom you work with to exclude you in ways that leave you feeling less than or otherwise demeaned in the workplace. And so for me, what that looked like was, very aggressive verbal confrontations with people, emails that were demeaning in their nature and how they addressed me. It was also exclusionary action. So, for example, hosting meetings with my whole team and not inviting me to the meetings.
Wow.
Or very actively people taking my work and claiming it was their own in public settings. So these types of things that really start to chip away at one's feeling of self-worth and the contributions you're making in the workplace. When I speak about workplace trauma, I also just want to recognize that trauma looks different for everyone. And in this context, I am referring to trauma with a lowercase t.
Okay.
And so if you look up, trauma as it's identified in the DSM, or looking at, how psychologists refer to trauma, they're often referring to harm that in some way is violating you in a sexual way or in a violent way against your physical body. And so when I'm talking about trauma, that is not the type of trauma I'm typically referring to. I am instead referring to emotional harm or harm to your personal well-being or psychology. So less so around physical bullying or altercations that we might think of in like a schoolyard setting, but more so in the workplace in particular. That can be a right place for, emotional and psychological harm, just given the number of interactions that we have with our peers and colleagues day to day.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you for breaking that down. I think that's going to be very helpful for a lot of people listening to this now and even maybe listening to the recording. And I think it's incredible that you now have a practice, right? And you've created space where these conversations can happen and people can really learn about trauma, learn about bullying, and think about how to do things differently. Let's actually start off with describing what inclusive leadership is. And I'm also going to invite someone onto the stage. What is inclusive leadership from your perspective, Marie?
Yep. So thank you for this question. And I'm already excited. I'm seeing the hands pop up. So this is going to be a good conversation. But when I'm referring to inclusive leadership, I am talking about leading in a way that acknowledges the individual ideas and perspectives of a multitude of people. This is leadership that fully recognizes and appreciates diversity of thought and perspectives, and is actively seeking out and inviting those new perspectives and voices and contributions into how we reach team goals, vision, and mission. And that can, for many people, feel like a very intangible idea or concept, but it actually is rooted in the mindset in which we come to the workplace and how we relate to other human beings and other people. And so for me, inclusive leadership is just at its foundation, just good leadership, and it's helping leaders learn to be more human in the workplace, which I think is often a forgotten skill set.
Yes. Well said. Before we move forward, Samira, great to see you. Thank you for always joining us week after week. Did you have a question, a thought, or something you wanted to share with the rest of the group?
Hi. I just wanted to I resonated with what Marie was talking about in terms of workplace trauma, and it's a name I gave to it when I tried to describe it to my friends when I experienced that, because that's the only thing I could think of. I didn't even know that was the term that was used to describe that. I just randomly called it workplace trauma. And another way I used to describe it was I felt psychologically unsafe at work, which I didn't know how else to describe it, because like she said, we think of trauma as like physical abuse and things like that, but for psychological abuse, I feel like it's even worse, because you cannot see the bruises physically, but you're hurting and you feel like you can't treat it, immediately. Because if it was a physical trauma, you could, feel it and see it and try to treat it. But psychological trauma is something completely different. And one way that I dealt with it was through therapy. And when I was able to go through the hurting phase, I like now, because I'm aware of the signs, I'm aware of what I should avoid, it's much easier to deal with at work. And luckily, I'm out of that toxic place. So I'm in a better place, more inclusive, since we are talking about inclusive workplaces, where for one, I am Ghanaian, but I live in France, so the language is different. My race is different. I'm in engineering, so my gender is like minority. I'm like the typical example. So here I feel included in work, included in discussions and things like that. When workplace inclusivity is where, like she said, everyone they take into account everything that everyone says, and they acknowledge everybody equally. And my current workplace feels that way versus the trauma I had to face in the previous one. That's what I just had to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm really glad that you've been able to find a place where you feel included. And most importantly, that you tried to even just describe what you were dealing with and going through. So thank you so much, Samira. And as always, thank you so much for joining these sessions as well. I appreciate it. Marie, any thoughts about what Samira has shared? What are some of the first steps maybe that an employee should take if they find themselves within this situation? And then I'd love to flip it on its head. What should leaders be doing as well?
Yeah. So first and foremost, thank you so much, Samira, for coming to the stage and sharing your reflections and your experience with workplace trauma. And in thinking about, Akua's question, this idea of like, what are the first steps if this is, where you find yourself? I love that immediately, Samira, one thing that you mentioned was really thinking about this idea of psychological safety. And for many people, I think psychological safety feels like a very nebulous or abstract idea. But there's actually a really great framework. For those who are familiar, the Center for Creative Leadership kind of breaks down psychological safety into 4 kind of steps or areas. And they're really kind of progressive if we think about them. But the first area is safe to be yourself. And then it progresses to feeling safe to fail or make mistakes, right? And then from there, if you feel safe enough to fail, if you're in a place where it's okay to make mistakes, then you feel safe to contribute new ideas. And then finally, kind of the epitome of psychological safety is feeling safe enough to challenge the status quo. And so when I think about people who are experiencing workplace trauma, I think about, well, how safe do you feel to first be yourself? How confident are you in this feeling that what you bring to the table, the fullness of your identity, is actually adding value in a way that is positive for your organization and also for your goals? And so I love that Samira mentioned seeking out therapy to support her in healing from and processing some of that workplace trauma, because I have found, even in my own experiences with therapy is a beautiful place for you to actually explore some of those corners of yourself that aren't getting acknowledged or recognized in other spaces. And so if we think about what can we as individual employees do in our trajectory towards healing from trauma, I do think a lot of it first starts with know thyself. And really creating some of that self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-validation internally before we even think about asking for it outside of ourselves. Because of course, external validation is fleeting and it's unreliable. But if we can cultivate self-confidence and self-esteem in ourselves and in who we are in the fullness of our identity, I love Samira mentioned all of her intersections, which I just love, right? So a Ghanaian working in France, working in technology and engineering. So many ways in which we can feel that we are marginalized or othered, but if we actually embrace all of those pieces of ourselves and truly validate ourselves in those things, that I think is the first step in creating psychological safety, regardless of the environment that you're in. So in some ways, our internal mindset gets to subvert our external environment. And then, Aku, I think you had another question then on what can leaders do.
Yes.
And I think even for leaders, it starts in the same place of know thyself.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of leaders are somewhat feeling triggered by this idea that they have to have everything right and they're not meant to show weakness or vulnerability. And actually, when leaders do lean into their vulnerabilities and can, for example, admit when they're wrong, admit when they've made mistakes, can own their imperfection and really steer away from this idea of perfectionism, right? And really embrace this idea of continuous and ongoing learning, it does two things. One, it really opens the door for that leader to know thyself and create psychological safety for themselves, which of course can then empower some of these other phases in psychological safety, right? Of being willing to try, to fail, to contribute, and to challenge the status quo, which is what we really need leaders to do and to get to. But the other thing that happens when leaders start owning some of their vulnerabilities and their humanity is it sets an example for other people. And oftentimes in our workplaces, the power dynamics are such that the people who are leaders with, a capital L, because of course all of us have capacity to lead, but the leaders who are in positions of authority, either through hierarchy or other means, oftentimes we are seeking for them to set the example and the tone. And so when they can be vulnerable, when they can own mistakes, when they can show up as imperfect, it actually opens the door and allows somewhat a bit of permission for everyone else to follow that example. So I think it's a really powerful tool if leaders can actually start to spend more time working on their own inner work, right? And their own self-confidence and internal validation, creating their own psychological safety because it sets an example, while also creating space for them to create an environment where folks feel ultimately safe enough to challenge, which is the epitome of psychological safety.
Yes, I love that. Being safe within yourself first. Samira, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I just wanted to once again, just invite everyone listening, please feel free to raise your hand if there's something you want to share, if you have a question you want to ask. We'd love to hear from you. Marie, I think this is, it's not exactly the best segue necessarily. Maybe it's a bit more of a pivot. But one of the things I really loved about what I found when I was doing some research about what we could potentially talk about was something where you posted about if you're going to quit, you should do it out loud. And to me, I think that also relates to having this strong inner game, right? It relates to being confident and having that inner psychological safety. Can you share a little bit more about your perspective on quitting? And when you quit, did you quit out loud?
Oh my goodness. So I love this question because of course quiet quitting was trending for a while.
Yes.
A few months ago, and then it sort of morphed into this idea of people rage applying for jobs and all of these very interesting ways of thinking about our relationship with work. But when I think about quiet quitting, first and foremost, I just want to acknowledge that my issue with quiet quitting is not so much folks choosing to conserve their own personal energy and resources. I think it is very smart for all of us to have boundaries and be very clear about where we choose to invest our resources. But for me, I think quiet quitting starts to really not be impactful or empowering when we think of it in terms of the idea of unmet needs. Right? So in any relationship, right, two or more people are coming together in order to hopefully have mutual needs met, right? Relationships are symbiotic in that way. And workplace relationships are probably one of the most prominent, the most time-consuming relationships that many people are in. We spend more time at work and with our colleagues and our teammates oftentimes than we spend with our loved ones, than we spend with romantic partners, than we spend with friends, right? We spend all of this time in these workplace relationships. And so if you were in any relationship and you find that for whatever reason, your needs are not being met emotionally, psychologically, right? Physically, all of these ways that human beings have needs. If your needs are not being met, it is no one's responsibility but your own to voice that and to correct that in collaboration with another person, with whoever it is you're in relationship with. Quiet quitting is the opposite of acknowledging our needs and looking for collaboration to have them met. Instead, what I've seen in people quiet quitting is people actually avoiding the conversation, right, where they get to acknowledge their needs out loud. And we refuse to name things, we actually diffuse any power for change to occur. And I think we can see that in real time in a lot of other places when we talk about equity, when we talk about marginalized communities. And oftentimes it's by choosing to not name things, choosing to subvert the definitions of things, that we actually see folks attacking equity and attacking and really demeaning, right, the value of a variety of people's needs, right? And so if we can name a thing, we can start to course correct, we can talk about it, we can engage with it and find new solutions in order for needs to be met. But if we can't name a thing, then we can't actually talk about it or create solutions together. And so if you have a problem with your work, if you're not being acknowledged, if you're not being seen, which of course are very human needs, right? They're all part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's listed. We need meaningful work, right? We need acknowledged meaningful work. Then it is your responsibility to actually voice that and have your needs met. Now, instead, if people are quiet quitting, they're never voicing their needs, they're never raising their hand to say like, hey, this isn't working for me and this is why, then what's occurring is you and your employer are now existing in two different conversations and two different relationships, where essentially you're in a relationship by yourself and your employer is having a relationship by themselves, where they're not getting their needs met, right? And they're feeling kind of dejected. What's going on in my relationship? They're confused. And you're not feeling supported because your needs aren't being met. But if the two of you were to actually come together and have a conversation where both could voice that, you could actually collaborate and create a different solution. So for me, absolutely, I quit out loud. I was very, very vocal about it. There was no quiet quitting over here. And that's also because they were very much, forcing me out loud.
Right.
It was very active bullying and harassment that was taking place. And as a person who worked very closely with the human resources department, remember, I was in learning and development, which often is tied to the human resource function. And so I saw all of what was happening in real time in terms of how they were choosing to protect themselves, in full acknowledgement that in the United States, being a Black woman, I am a protected class. And being fired unjustly or as a result of discrimination is opening them up to liability, right, for a lawsuit. And so there were all of these hoops they were jumping through, trying to make something very wrong seem legally acceptable. And so I saw all of this, and I had a very confronting conversation with the woman who was kind of offender number one for me, and said, it's very clear that we don't work well together and that you don't respect me. And I don't actually need to respect you in order to do my job well. So what is it that we're going to do here?
Ooh.
And she was unable to have that conversation with me. Right? She was unable. And again, this is where it's so important for leaders to do their own inner work. Because I can only imagine all of the emotions and the things that were happening for her and how triggering that type of conversation could be for her. But again, that's for her to own, not for me to own. Right? Because I was very clear about my value and what was happening, but she was not clear about how her actions were actually negating her own goals. So this is where I think quiet quitting doesn't actually serve us. It doesn't actually bias check people when that's what's required. It doesn't actually call people to the mat to do better. And instead, we kind of walk away and leave people in their dysfunction when we were right there in the relationship with them and could have said something to make them improve.
Wow. Still processing what you just shared, but just wow. It's really a perspective I haven't really looked at, but I really appreciate it. And I agree. I think a huge part of being able to lead, be a leader, have influence, connect with others is, right, having those tough conversations. And it does start with, first self-regulating, self-managing yourself. And it's very difficult to have these conversations if that's not a skill that you've been able to develop. Wow.
Well, it's all kind of goes back to this idea of emotional intelligence, right? And there have been lots of studies around emotional intelligence and leadership, and leaders who have high EQ, high emotional intelligence, time and time again, they're outperforming leaders with high IQ, right? And so social awareness and social regulation, both,
Mm-hmm.
and self-awareness and self-regulation are so much better predictors of efficacy for leadership than high intelligence, right? Because of course, work, right, is a social engagement,
Mm-hmm.
right? The job of a leader is not for you to actually do the work. The job of a leader is for you to get work done through others, which requires you to have a high level of social capability, awareness, and regulation skills. And so if you as a leader haven't first done your own self-regulation skills, you are definitely not in a position to try and regulate an entire social environment, an entire team, right?
Yeah.
That's, I don't know how much more of the blind leading the blind we could be doing.
No, that's exactly it. That's exactly what I always love to share with my clients. And it's unfortunate how many people don't necessarily see that. And I guess it maybe starts with models, right? It maybe starts with you've seen other leaders show up in a particular way. It seems like they've been successful showing up in a way where they maybe don't have those social abilities. They themselves haven't, regulated themselves, but they seem to be able to achieve to a certain level, get access to opportunities and resources.
Yeah. And I think that is somewhat the conundrum people find themselves in. Like, why should I spend so much time on self-awareness, on social awareness and regulation if I can see people who are essentially social inept who seem to be thriving?
Yep.
It is a hard sell for many people, but it also kind of goes back to thinking about, well, what are your goals? And do you actually know yourself well enough? Or are you instead seeking validation against someone else's standard, right?
Yes.
Because I know, and I can only speak for myself, but for me, it's actually really important that I'm a kind of leader that actually is supporting other people and is acknowledging other people, and acknowledging the contributions of others. And again, for me, a lot of that is personal, just based on my own experience and experiencing what it feels like when that's not happening, and how debilitating that can be. But I do think there's a case for leaders to really clearly articulate for themselves, well, what kind of leader do you want to be? You could get a lot done. That's possible without that kind of social and emotional skill set. But the data is clear that you could still be getting a lot done, but you're probably going to have a lot of churn, and it's not going to be nearly as efficient as it could be if you were actually inviting people to collaborate and go there with you instead of just kind of bulldozing ahead, irregardless of the emotions and impact that you're making on others.
Yes, yes. And I think that really, segues very nicely into this next sort of topic or this next theme that I had here about why collaboration over competition always wins. Earlier on, I had a conversation with another sort of, he's a facilitator, also works in a similar space to us. And he was talking about humanness and high performance and how so many people feel like in order to be a high performer or have a high performance company, you have to remove the humanness. And I heard you mention humanness in your intro as well. Can you talk a little bit more about why collaboration over competition always wins and how we can incorporate more humanness into how we show up?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, collaboration is really all about embodying an abundance mindset, right? Collaboration means we are actually not afraid to support each other because we honestly believe that the sum is greater than its parts, right? That us working together can be and achieve exponential results versus us working individually. And so when that happens, right, and we actually believe that there is sufficient resources for everyone's needs to get met, amazing things can actually happen, right? Even going back to that example of, quiet quitting, right? It doesn't have to be adversarial, an employee and or it could actually be collaborative if we can think of shared goals. But if we don't have shared goals, then why on earth are we working together? So, so I think that's kind of the rub for everyone is really getting clear, like, well, what are your shared goals? There's a reason why, if you're an employee, you're working at that company. There has to be a piece of that vision, that mission that speaks to you and to your values. Otherwise, you shouldn't be there. But in this way, that's where collaboration is possible. If we can find shared values, then it makes it easy to collaborate and it makes us easy to actually benefit exponentially from each other's gifts, talents, and contributions. I think the other thing that's kind of important here is thinking about it through the lens of inclusive leadership. And usually when I speak about inclusive leadership, I speak about it in kind of 4 key pillars. And one of those key pillars is collaboration. Because again, can't fully acknowledge the contributions of everyone if we're not engaging them in conversation, if we're not inviting them into spaces where they can contribute, which again is like part of this idea of psychological safety. And so collaboration is part of being an inclusive leader. It's different than, having, an equity statement, right? Is very different than actually engaging with communities who are marginalized and collaborating with them around solutions, right? But it oftentimes, when we see leaders seeking to be more equity-minded or more inclusive, they're instead looking for, what's the right thing to do versus the wrong thing to do. And we're kind of stuck in a binary. But collaboration opens up infinite possibilities and the binary tends to dissolve. So it's always an opportunity to think about how could we create more out of our shared values and our shared contributions versus competing. And, when you compete, someone always has to lose. But in collaboration, it's always a win-win. So why wouldn't we want more collaboration?
I love that. I absolutely love that. And would love to, once again, just open it up to those of you listening. If anyone wants to share a perspective, you want to join us on stage, you have another thought about collaboration and competition, please feel free to raise your hands. We'd love to hear from you. But thank you. Thank you so much for that, Marie, for breaking that down. And yeah, just giving us some interesting things to think about in relation to collaboration and competition. So you talked a bit about emotional intelligence, a few minutes ago. And another thing that I found when I was thinking about what we should cover today was, something that you wrote around empathy mongering. So can you tell us what empathy mongering is and the importance of it as it relates to consciousness and leadership?
Yeah, so this one's really interesting because I actually came across this online, and I posted something about one of my courses around inclusive leadership, and an internet troll showed up in the comment section and said something to the effect that empathy mongering is what's like wrong with the world today, and there's too many people who are essentially weaponizing empathy.
I'm just shaking my head. I'm like, wow.
I was just kind of I was really kind of like blown back, like trying to unpack, like, what does that even mean? And I even responded to them, like, I am not familiar with this concept the way that you're describing it. What does it mean to be an empathy monger? And of course, when I think of even the word mongering, it's a very negative connotation. Because usually when we think of mongering, it's attached to fear mongering, war mongering, things that are actually very traumatizing and are designed to incite fear and hesitation and resistance for people. But the word itself, mongering, is not negative. Mongering actually it literally just means widely spreading or promoting something. And so I kind of laugh at this idea of like, how is spreading the idea of empathy a bad thing? And whenever I'm in conversation with people, I'm truly trying to understand their perspective. Like, how could it be possible that spreading the idea of empathy could be a bad thing? And it's a bit of a brain teaser, but bear with me, because I do think for some people, they do see empathy and emotions in some way being weaponized in order to bend others to their will. And so I think of it, especially when we look at something as simple as the use of pronouns, for example, right? I think this is a really good example of how we, when we institute pronouns as a community and say like, hey, let's introduce ourselves with our pronouns, how that can be very inclusive for people who are non-gender conforming, right? And for people who are not familiar with that or unaccustomed to acknowledging people who are non-gender conforming, that can feel very uncomfortable. And when we think about this idea of empathy mongering, it's then, okay, well, if I am doing this in service of the feelings of someone else and really trying to put myself in the position of someone else and how they feel, and in doing that, I am then forced to do something that makes me uncomfortable, right, then isn't this person using their emotions for my own discomfort? And I thought it's just kind of and again, a bit of a brain teaser,
Yeah.
right? This idea of how is it that we've now made it a negative thing to try to understand the emotions of others because they might be unfamiliar to us, because all that discomfort is just lack of familiarity, right?
Yeah.
But it's really helping people kind of make that jump of like, oh, okay, I see that something is making you uncomfortable. Could you maybe unpack what about it is uncomfortable or foreign? And then from a very kind of fact-based place of like, oh, this is different, that's not how I usually refer to people, etc., we could then get to, okay, and how does doing this in some way run counter to your goals as a human being, as a leader, as a teammate, as a colleague? Because that's the real conversation, right? It's not a matter of I'm uncomfortable or not. It's really a matter of, does this way of being and interacting with people actually serve our collaborative goals or not? But I was just kind of fascinated by this idea that people could think of empathy as a negative, because I have never, ever thought that having a better understanding of other people and their lived experiences could somehow be a negative for me. And actually, quite the contrary. I think most people spend their entire lives trying to understand themselves and unpack who they are and their identity, their purpose, their value, all of these things. And so much of that process is accelerated through empathizing, understanding, engaging with the experiences, feelings of other people, right? It's through those engagements, through those social interactions that we actually get clear about who we are. So it was a bit of a double leap, this idea of, well, if it's uncomfortable, then it must be bad.
Yes. That's really it. I think for so many of us, unfortunately, those go hand in hand, right? And you said that, right? Not being willing to sit in that uncomfortableness and really break it down to understand how it actually relates or doesn't relate to what we value.
Exactly. But I think it's, thinking about how that relates to leaders, it again goes back to this idea of, well, like, know thyself. Are you aware when you're triggered? Are you aware when you're in a heightened nervous system state? Are you aware that something is making you uncomfortable? And are you willing to investigate that, right? So much of how we show up day to day is coming from a place of the automatic, right? Of gut reactions, initial responses. I'm really trying not to use the word unconscious bias here because I think it's just so overused. But oftentimes the way we interact is not operating from the prefrontal cortex. It's not effortful, thoughtful intention in how we go about our life and work. And, a lot of that is because the brain's doing a lot and needs to reduce cognitive load. So it looks for shortcuts. And so we're on autopilot most of the day. But if you're going to be a leader, you got to be willing to turn off autopilot and do some thinking work. You have to be willing to look at, hey, I just had a reaction. I just, especially the negative reactions. Hey, I'm having a response. You have to be willing to slow down enough to investigate that and actually determine, hey, is this response actually supporting my goals, or is this an opportunity to rewire how I've been approaching things? Because of course, that's where innovation lives, right? And turning off the automatic. I'm going to do it different for the sake of doing it differently and see what happens there, right? But I think that's extremely powerful for leaders to think about. Hey, I'm having an emotional response, or I'm not understanding someone's needs in this moment. How could I explore that? How could I lean into empathy and try to understand that experience and really break through the discomfort in order to find a new awareness, not just for yourself, but then of course that gets to impact how you engage socially as well.
Yes. I know you can't see me. I'm just nodding the heck out of my head out of everything that you shared. And, one thing I did want to ask, just because you mentioned it, but you mentioned that unconscious bias is overused. I'd love to hear a little bit more of your perspective on that.
Oh my goodness. So everyone looks to and even now it's been a few years now since I think COVID-19 really pushed to the forefront a lot of racial inequity around the world. And that has continued to ripple across a number of other identity markers, especially now when we look at, gender identity especially. But there's just so many ways in which the last 3 years and kind of the collective trauma of lockdown forced us to look at some really hard things. And in this process, I think everyone's kind of go-to solution is, well, I'm just going to take an unconscious bias training and that's going to fix it.
Yes.
And that just breaks my heart because, and don't get I love neuroscience. I think it's very important. Like I believe in science and all of these things. And unconscious bias at its best is a theory. It is not a strategic plan. It is not a course of action. It is not change management, right? Unconscious bias and unconscious bias training is literally an awareness exercise, right? Which again, if we kind of go back to even thinking about emotional intelligence, self-awareness is like step one.
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
That's, yeah.
Like I'm aware, right? I am aware. And then step two is then, okay, can you regulate yourself with that awareness? What are you doing with this new knowledge that you are on autopilot? What are you doing with this new knowledge that you have preferences, right? What are you doing with this knowledge that you have biases for and against things, people, ideas? What are you doing with it? And so I hesitate to raise unconscious bias just because so many people hold that as like the end of their journey in inclusive leadership when it's actually the beginning, if not like zero.
Is it like, oh, it's my unconscious bias, I can't change anything about it, I'm done?
Right. It's like, oh, well, this is my past to actually not do anything and not.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oops, I'm a human. My bad.
I'm just human. It's fine. It's like, it is fine to be a human and, right?
Exactly.
Like,
no, that's, yeah.
Like, like, and, right? Like, what do you do next? You know, when I talk to folks about like, how does your advocacy show up? Right? I have to remind them that to advocate is a verb. This is an action.
I like that.
These are actions you're taking. These are not ideas that you're thinking. You sitting at home reading White Fragility for the 5th time is not actually changing the world, right? Like you have to get off your tuchus here and actually do something. You have to take those ideas and turn them into action, right? All vision starts with an idea, but it doesn't actually turn into fruition until we put action behind it, right? Plans, people, resources, right? And so I try not to bring up unconscious bias in conversation because people tend to gravitate towards it as though they've done something when in fact they just thought of doing something, which is not the same.
Yes. And I saw, Sharon in the audience, lots of clapping there. Thank you so much, Sharon, for the applause. I'm assuming that a lot of what was just shared resonated. So thank you so much. And Mary, yeah, just thank you so much for sharing that. Like I said, I was just curious to hear your perspective on it. One last call for questions for Marie. If you have a question for her or something you want to share, something that she even shared, maybe that resonated, please feel free to raise your hand. I'd love to bring you on stage. And while you're hopefully clicking that button to raise your hand so I can bring on stage, Marie, I did want to ask you about the support you provide to those who also want to build their own businesses. Wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, as you know, like a lot of my work kind of helps people who are transitioning out of toxic corporate culture and seeking to build something else. And I do a lot of work specifically supporting consultants in that area. And so one of the ways that we do that, we have a group coaching program. It's a 6-month program that really kind of walks people through some of that initial detox of unhealthy corporate culture, and then starting to think about how they can approach building a consultancy business in a way that truly honors them and the fullness of their identity. And it's probably one of my most favorite things to do, to actually just walk with people through that journey and through that transformation. And in that program, we focus on 4 key areas. The first is thinking about proprietary framework and the way that you actually support your clients and what you're doing. The second is looking at a pricing and how you're valuing yourself and your contributions to do that work. We also look at the people that you put in place, really building a team, again, taking this idea of collaboration and putting it in action, because of course we go further when we go together. And then finally, looking at your playbook or your standard operating procedures. How can you actually operationalize things, automate things, and make it easy for you to show up as your best? And so that's one of my favorite things to do in support of new entrepreneurs. And that's a 6-month program. We call it Build It B2B. And so you can find information about that on my website.
Yes. And maybe to close, where can people just find more about you? Let us know your website and the best way for people to get in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is mariedeveaux.com. So just my first name, last name. Best way to reach out to me is probably for you to submit an inquiry through the website. I think a couple months ago, I would probably say reach out to me on LinkedIn, but LinkedIn has been getting very spammy as of late. And so I don't know if I will find the meaningful messages in the midst of sales messages that I receive on LinkedIn these days. So I would recommend definitely reach out to me via the website, and that'll come directly to my inbox and we can connect there.
Yes. I mean, he's not here anymore, but there was someone from LinkedIn in here for a second. So I'll pass on the message.
Yeah, I don't know. This used to be my favorite platform, and I don't know. Things are changing. I have feelings.
I always joke that once you put coach or consultant anywhere in your headline or in your anywhere on your profile, all of a sudden you just get inundated with lots of in messages and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's time for us to maybe reclaim these terms. I don't know what else to call myself. That's literally what I do.
No, same. But I think I'm lucky because I'm based in a different part of the world, so they don't focus on me too much. I think they probably search for people in certain places, and because I'm not in the
Oh
US
my goodness.
or in Europe, they're like, eh.
That's so funny. But now you really have me thinking about like a rebrand for my headline. Maybe I should be the inclusive leadership whisperer or something.
It might make a difference. I don't know.
I love it.
All right. Well, Marie, thank you so much for joining me today. You could be anywhere else, but you're here with us. So thank you so much. And thank you to all listening. And thank you to those of you who are watching the replay. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you all so very much for joining me today. We're here most Fridays. Well, it's Friday afternoon for me, morning for those of you who are in the US. Thank you again for joining us and have a great weekend.